These past few weeks, New Zealand upped its ante by lowering the cap on Russian crude oil as part of its sanctions. And MFAT prepares to put forth its statement on New Zealand's position on Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly.
A swell of Palestinian colour and a familiar call for freedom filled Auckland's Aotea Square.
Meanwhile, nearly 20,000 people took to the streets in Auckland last week at a rally calling for sanctions against Israel.
We came to support Palestine because there's innocent people losing their lives.
This is not about race or culture, this is about the humanity.
Welcome to Here Now with me, Kadambri Raghukumar. Today, sanctions and what our various diasporas feel about them: Russian, Ukrainian, Palestinian and Israeli Kiwis. Last week, clergy from various churches prayed, fasted and camped outside electoral offices, calling for New Zealand to place immediate sanctions on Israel.
I thought it was a wonderful demonstration of what the church really stands for, its teachings, and the hope of a better future for all of us, including our own children. That's
Katrina Mitchell-Kutab. She's a recipient of the New Zealander of the Year Local Hero Award for her service to community. A Palestinian Christian, Katrina tells me she's been subjected to sexual violence by the Israeli Defense Force, settler violence and home demolition, while her wider family continues to live in the occupied Palestinian territories.
I have family who were killed in Gaza when they were sheltering in the St. Porphyrius' church, and I also had a relative who died of a failure to be able to reach any medical help because he had a burst appendix in the Holy Family Church and was shot at if they tried to leave. In terms of a Christian message, Jesus would always and has always preached about ensuring that you support those who are downtrodden, that you're not using violence, that you care for your neighbour, that you invite your enemy to the table. So it is absolutely within the church's scope to stand up against what is happening in Palestine. And we were all very supportive of the clergy in doing that. And I cannot see any reason from any church that follows the teachings of Christianity to not support that or to stand against calling for humanity to intervene and ensure that children aren't shot, that people can receive food and aid, and that we stop what is happening across in Palestine, which has far-reaching international legal concerns in moving forward as a global society.
United in their calls for an end to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
When an estimated 20,000 people came out onto Auckland streets, many in the crowd were calling for the New Zealand government to introduce sanctions against Israel.
Protest is legitimate if it's within the law.
Here's Juliet Moses of the New Zealand Jewish Council.
I don't think that it's fully grasping the situation here. You know, it's notable that none of these protests ever call for the release of the hostages and for Hamas to be disarmed. If Hamas was disarmed and stepped down, that would be much better for the people of Gaza and much better for the people of Israel and much more likely to actually lead to a sustainable, situation of peace or at least a ceasefire. Nobody who's protesting ever seems to call for that. And I find that very remarkable. Had more pressure gone on Hamas right after October 7, we would be in a very different situation now. And it's just a great shame that these protesters don't seem to recognise that reality.
As of September 2025, the death toll in Gaza is close to 65,000 people. Taimur Hazu is of Palestinian and Pakeha Whakapapa and the former executive director of Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria, and he identifies as Palestinian Christian. Taimur thinks that sanctions are precisely the point.
Even after we've had the International Association of Genocide Scholars and the UN Commission all saying this is now a textbook genocide, people like Omar Bartov, the Israeli-American genocide expert, saying it's a textbook genocide, we can't find the conviction in our Kiwi values to actually call this out and put sanctions in place on Israel.
New Zealand so far has placed some travel bans on Israeli ministers and extremist settlers from West Bank. New Zealand has also placed sanctions on Hamas and Hezbollah, calling them terrorist entities. Over in Europe, governments have been preparing or placing sanctions against Israel. Norway is pulling out investments, Spain blocking weapons and settlement goods, Ireland banning settlement products, and the EU Commission proposing stronger intervention measures like suspension of free trade with Israel. Now, New Zealand doesn't have a law for autonomous sanctions, so a specific legislation needs to be passed, like the Russian Sanctions Act of 2022. And since the Act came into effect, New Zealand has designated more than 1,900 individuals, entities and shipping vessels along with a series of trade measures. So what are the advocates for sanctions on Israel pushing the government to do? Katrina again.
But I think the government's taking a very narrow scope on what actually sanctions can mean and how they can be far-reaching and broad. So, for example, you can put in place diplomatic sanctions, so expelling the ambassador here from Israel or closing its embassy temporarily until Israel starts to abide by international law, particularly in terms of genocide and the famine that is happening. You can also look at cutting academic ties with Israel and its cultural ties. You can look at the trade and investment partnerships that New Zealand actually has, especially with machinery and technology. There are a lot of avenues that this government could actually take to ensure that they're putting pressure on Israel to abide by international law and stop this horrific situation that our families have been put in. So we've also, New Zealand and Israel have what they call the Innovation Hub that was created in 2021 to foster trade and innovation between New Zealand and the tech sector in Israel. So aside from the traditional sanctions that the government is looking at, there are a lot of avenues that it can take and should take because of its erga omnes, its third-party obligations as a signatory to the many international legal requirements that it has. And we're just not seeing that. We're just seeing a lot of excuses and a lack of action.
Does Taimur think that there could be any real impact of sanctions?
I think there's, without an absolute question of doubt, that sanctions would have an impact. It brought South Africa to the table in terms of change and the economic hardship that it started to face in the downturn in the economy. It brought Myanmar back to, the civil table, between quotation marks, with the junta letting Aung San Suu Kyi back into the country and the government. Let's not talk about the genocide against the Rohingya, but it did work. One could say that the sanctions over Iran had a big part in bringing them back to the negotiation table with the IEA and with Obama. I think actually in the case of Israel, they will work even better. It shouldn't be lost on any New Zealander that the Spanish Prime Minister has called for a complete sporting ban of all Israeli teams in international sporting events because of the way Israel has forged a path that kind of keeps one foot as the only democracy in the Middle East, between quotation marks, and then as a Western nation by its virtue of its participation in things like Eurovision, right? So they're European, culturally they're European. So there's no question that they would work.
Juliet Moses thinks that it makes no sense to use sanctions as measures against Israel.
Hamas invaded Israel's sovereign borders on October the 7th, not the other way. Russia invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory. So we're looking at two very different situations. There's a range of views, of course, within our community, as in any community, but I think generally the consensus would be strongly against, sanctions against Israel. In other words, not supporting sanctions against Israel. There is a two-sided war going on here. People who support sanctions tend to invisibilize Hamas. They don't talk about Hamas's role in this at all. They don't talk about the fact that Hamas is actually oppressing its own people, the Gazan people. Occasionally we see these sort of spurts of dissent against Hamas before it all gets suppressed again. Hamas is still holding on to the hostages, and they have threatened to do October 7 over and over again in pursuit of their explicitly genocidal policy against Israel, and they have refused to disarm. So we have a situation where there is a two-sided war going on, and sanctions against one side is simply going to enable and embolden the other side, and that's going to take, everyone further away from peace. So I think there is a recognition that Israel does have a right to defend its sovereign territory. Now, of course, you can argue whether it's gone too far. I don't know whether sanctions really make much difference in practice to any particular situation, or whether they change the behaviour that I guess they're hoping to change. But I guess, they can certainly have a symbolic effect, if nothing else. I don't know specifically enough, for example, whether, it really has, what kind of practical impact it has made in terms of Russia. But I guess you would have to say that it appears that Russia is continuing on, with its war and its invasion of Ukraine. So it wouldn't appear to have made much change in terms of their behaviour.
I reached out to the former Ukrainian honorary consul Alex Kurichuk and asked him what he thought of New Zealand's sanctions on Russia and what impact they've had.
I can't see any result from previous sanctions, and maybe these sanctions also would be not so different from previous. I can say that in Wellington, it's quite big embassy of Russia and consulate as well. It's about 20 people. And same, maybe smaller size embassy and consulate in Moscow continuously during this war. But no one in Kiev and not one Ukrainian here in New Zealand. So the best picture to describe the result of sanctions. We believe in sanctions, what is acting in reality and provide result, efficient result.
And what is the result you would like to see?
Result should be to make some inconvenience for people who support war. Thanks the God, there is no war here in between the Russians and Ukrainian, and it means that common sense take over, because it's not people war, it's war in between President Putin and President Zelensky.
I tried to get hold of members from our Russian community to hear their voices, but couldn't find anyone who was comfortable or keen enough to talk about this topic. The embassy in Wellington, though, sent me the statement. The sanctions have no impact on Russia, maybe only on New Zealand. The fact that Wellington has readily followed the Russophobic line while overlooking its own interests again demonstrates the lack of its independence in foreign policies and servile fealty to the leaders of the collective West. The statement also says that, as to many other global conflicts, New Zealand's position is biased and one-sided as well. That's Here Now this week with me, Kadambari Raghukumar. A big thank you to Taimur Hazu, Katrina Mitchell-Kutab, Alex Kurichuk, Juliet Moses and the Russian Embassy for talking to me and sharing their views on this episode of Here Now. Today's episode was mixed by Ellie Marsden and I'm your producer and host, Kadambari Raghukumar. Thanks for listening.